So priorities for social sustainability, this is similar to the environmental sustainability ones, but it's going to be a lot fuzzier and mushier because this stuff is qualitative, and it's much harder to try to get numeric, quantitative values of these things and set quantitative priorities about what's more important than other things, especially because so many of these things are deeply intertwined and self-reinforcing. And you'll see that a little bit as we go along. But the same question remains. If your company could invent anything, or in this case, I say do anything because it might be how your company operates as well, might not be the things that you make. But if you could do anything, where would you do the most good? And there's, like I said, there's not a universal set of agreements here, but people broadly agree on these things, that it's barriers to opportunity in health and safety, wealth, which is not just income, but also property ownership, and influence, whether that be political influence or speech in communities or mass media, education and other forms of teaching yourself stuff, and meaning or culture. And these come from both the more recent sources, like you folks read the Sustainable Development Goals, and also some older things like John Locke in the 1600s, Thomas Paine in the 1700s. And one fundamental concept to get across right away is the difference between equality and equity. So why are racetracks always designed like this instead of like this? Yeah.
The circumference of a racetrack is different on the inside.
Absolutely. And so looking at it, the untrained eye would probably look at this and say, hey, this is fair because everyone is starting out at an equal place, until you look more carefully and you see that actually the structure of the playing field is such that this person would be disadvantaged and this person would be disadvantaged more. And so that's why every racetrack ever is built this way, because they know that there is a structural inequality in the playing field. And this is something that's easy to see in a racetrack. It's much harder to see in society. And there are lots of forms of privilege that people have, and most of us are fairly blind to them, because there's this effect in psychology called the headwinds tailwinds effect, where we really notice the things that are barriers and problems that we have to deal with. We don't really notice the things that are a tailwind, that are helping push us along. And so, like while I, as a white male who is straight and speaks English as a native language, have a lot of privilege, it's not like I notice that on a daily basis. And so it helps to have that pointed out to me, or to think about it critically, and not just go to my day-to-day experience and be like, But so yeah, so that's a fundamental concept there. So going into all these individual things, and again, we'll put them all back together at the end. Health and safety, this is the most quantifiable one, and there's some overlap with it and our environmental sustainability priorities. So this is a list from the U.S. Bureau of Disease collaborators, looking at risk factors, what causes the most death and disability to people in the U.S. And you can see top one is smoking, high body mass index, that is being overweight, bad diet, alcohol and drug use, high fasting plasma glucose, that is basically diabetes and other high blood sugar, which is again mostly diet driven, blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera. So most of these things are lifestyle. They're choices that people are making, and the environments that they're in. What food is available, what food is affordable, what food is around. But a lot of it is diet and lifestyle. And then it's not until down here that air pollution is a big risk factor. But if you look at other places around the world, so for example, India, air pollution is the #1 killer or cause of disability. And there are still dietary risks, but actually malnutrition is high up the list here, whereas in the US it was way down there. And so this is another reason why it's hard to make universal statements about social sustainability, because they're often more context dependent than environmental things like CO2 is just distributed globally because air is a solution. And so and so for occupational health and safety, because remember there were things here. Oh yeah, occupational risks is there, and in the US occupational risks were here, actually higher up. And so what are the causes of those occupational risks? You know, if you're on the job, what's most likely to kill you or injure you? And it's mostly transportation things, falling or slipping, violence, dangerous equipment that you're working with, exposure to hazardous chemicals, and I would say fires and explosions are usually due to chemicals as well. So, so again, this is where there's some overlap with the environmental sustainability. You know, it's nice to eliminate hazardous chemicals and have less transportation or slower and safer transportation. So if we're going to summarize priorities for health and safety, I would say lifestyle, transport, workplace safety, chemicals, and pollution like air pollution. So what are companies doing that could benefit this? Well, autonomous vehicles, not just cars, but vehicles in factories and other places, can, at least in theory, help to avoid accidents, because in theory, computers will eventually be able to do that better than humans. And in terms of healthy food and snacks and things, there's a whole health food industry. It's been around for a long time. And in terms of chemicals, reusing an example from last time, this is paint that is made out of milk rather than made out of more hazardous chemicals that can be carcinogenic or cause other health problems. And then there's tons of fitness apps and trackers and things like that that can help people with their lifestyle, drive them to get more exercise, etc. Okay, so next one, wealth. And wealth, it's not a question of absolute wealth, it's a question of wealth inequality. Even today, a lot of the poorest people in the world, you know, even homeless people in the U.S. or you know, poor rural farmers in a lot of developing countries have cell phones. Maybe not the fanciest, newest cell phone, but any cell phone at all is a piece of technology that the richest kings and queens of 100 years ago could never even imagine, much less own. So it's not a question of absolute wealth, it's a question of the inequality between what some people have and other people don't that is correlated with things like crime and violence and things like that. And so this is an interesting study that some Harvard Business School people did and a psychologist at Duke, asking people in the U.S. How wealth is distributed in the U.S. and how they how they would like it to be. So, so here, people think that they would like wealth to be distributed such that the richest 20% of people own 30 or 35% of the wealth in the country, and that the poorest, you know, 20, 40, 60% still own about half the wealth in the country. And this is what most Americans think is actually the case now. So we think that the richest 20% own about 50% of the wealth in the country, and that the bottom 60% own maybe 20%. What do you think the actual values are? Do you think this is accurate? No? Do you think it's more this way or more this way? Yeah, it's really far this way. So the top 20% own about 85% of all the wealth, and the poorest 60% of people own about 5% of the wealth. And this has gone back and forth over history. This is a chart of that same kind of thing over the last 100 years-ish, except only looking at the top 1%, 0.1%, and 0.01%. And so today's rates of inequality are unmatched since the Great Depression, basically. And interestingly, this kind of wealth correlates, or this wealth inequality correlates to GDP growth, to the growth of the economy overall. And whether this is causal or not, you can debate. A lot of economists do argue that it's causal. But you can see that in times when wealth inequality was going down sharply because there were big redistributions of wealth happening, is when the economic growth rate was highest and best. And these last 10 years or so, when inequality has been going up again, has had the least economic growth, some people would say, as a result. And so what was causing this redistribution of wealth? There's the Great Depression that caused a lot of taxation of the wealthy, and then actually World War II was the biggest redistribution of wealth in history. And the top tax rates from like 1949 onward, mostly to pay for the debt that was incurred by all the industrialization of World War I that gave people, World War II that gave people all these jobs and redistributed that wealth. So the top tax rate was over 90% from 1951 through 1963. And then that has just been eased off since then to, in 2012, it was 39.6%. And so that's before any of the current government's tax cuts, this is back in 2012. And so just to be clear, this is not a partisan thing, not a Democrat or Republican thing. These tax rates happened under both parties. And so where do some of these wealth inequalities come from? Well, a lot of it is driven by gender. And I hate to tell you, but the more educated you get, the bigger the income disparity becomes between men versus women. And a lot of it is also racially driven. So if you look at white families' wealth, not just income, but wealth, over the last 50 years or so, white families now have 5 to 10 times as much wealth as African American and Hispanic families in the US. Again, this will vary by country, and there'll be different racial groups that are on top or on the bottom, et cetera. Yeah.
So this is total wealth and not income?
Right. Yeah. And so a lot of what this is driven by is actually number of years of home ownership. And so that's a matter of property, not income. And then household income is the second thing, and then other things like education. And this actually is, at least in part, the result of explicitly discriminatory political policies. So have any of you heard of redlining? Anyone? Yeah? Can you just explain what it is quickly?
Well, as I understand it, it's basically like the idea of forcing certain racial groups into housing in different areas of cities with either fewer services or jacked up interest rates or other such things.
Yeah, exactly. So the U.S. Federal Housing Authority drew red lines on maps and said that in these neighborhoods, only white people are allowed to get home loans. And so that explicitly made it more difficult for people who are not white to own a home or own a home in a decent neighborhood where property values would accumulate. So reasons for wealth inequality, or ways to fix wealth inequality. Getting access to property for low-income people and people who don't have much property. Raising low incomes, providing education for low-income people so they can get job skills to get higher incomes. And then progressive taxation. That's something that you as a company are probably not going to do, but you never know. You could at least do things like have a reasonable ratio of CEO pay to average worker pay. And so good examples of this. This is a project that I actually helped with called World Bike. It was, the idea was to make cargo carrying bicycles for poor rural farmers in Africa as a way of providing them more means to make an income by basically making it easier to get their goods to market with a bike that was very affordable, but yet still robust enough that they can carry lots of heavy stuff on it rather than breaking down all the time, which is what happens with most cheap bikes. And interestingly, it was very popular here in the US, got into this fancy museum exhibit, but actually when it hit the ground in the real world, in Kenya, or was it Ethiopia? No, it was Kenya. It actually didn't do that well in the market because people didn't have enough access to capital. And so what actually ended up working better was more of a microloan program, getting people access to capital. And this is a company called Bombas that makes socks, and they have a business model where it's called give one, get one. So if you as a customer in the US buy a pair of their socks, they will send you a pair of socks, and they will also send a pair of socks to someone who is more in need, whether that be really low-income people in the US or in developing countries. And there are other companies that do that as well. Kiva is a company that makes microloans in a peer-to-peer way. So it's a website that you can go on and see all these projects where people are asking for loans. And you can just say, oh yeah, I'm going to spend $50 on that. And that money will, most of that money will go to that person who will then take that money, maybe they're buying a bicycle to carry cargo or something. And then, interestingly, these loans get repaid at a much higher rate than normal bank loans do. So there's some kind of social proof going on there. And Goodwill does a lot of job training where they're looking for, underskilled people or underserved minorities to give them job skills and a living wage job. Okay, then influence. This can be politics. It's largely politics, but it can also be influence in the company. So it's not, there's two scales. There's within the company and then how the company interacts with the rest of the world as well. So just a couple other inequality stats. If you look at the racial breakdown of the US population, there's this percent, it's about 60% white, and then Hispanic, African American, Asian American, etc. But then you look at those ratios in the US House of Representatives and the US Senate, you can see that it's much more skewed. And here is by gender, again, fairly skewed, and this is including the recent election that has had more women than ever before in history. So I'm not saying that we should have quotas on this thing. I'm just pointing out these are disparities that exist. And there are, again, sometimes explicit policies that work against this. I don't know if you remember the law on the New Hampshire ballot that was designed to, well, the law changed so that you had to be a permanent resident to be a voter here rather than just a temporary resident. And that law, a lot of people argue, was specifically designed to make it harder for students to vote because they know that student votes have a particular political leaning that does not match the people who were writing this legislation. And so this stuff can affect you directly. And and also there are things in New Hampshire like you can't vote by mail unless you have some excuse showing that you're out of town. None of the states that I've lived in for the past 20 years have done that. And so, if you have a job, where you need to go to work every day, it might be hard for you to show up at the polls. Yeah.
I just have a quick question about this specifically. So, someone who's a student in New Hampshire, for example, they might only live in the state for like 3 or 4 years or something, and then they're going to go somewhere else. So I feel like it kind of makes sense they don't want them to dictate their political views of the state if they're not going to be around.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I think to counter that, there's always going to be a population of students in this state that is going to perpetuate itself, and that political leaning, it's an assumption to assume that political leaning will stay the same, but it's not to say that that group will somehow disappear after those 3 years, even though new people cycle through.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I would have said. Yeah. Okay, so what are companies doing to help this out? Interestingly, one of the first 10 Facebook apps was called Causes. It's an app designed to help people do grassroots organizing. And there's another one called ResistBot, which makes it easier for you to contact your representatives in Congress or the Senate. And it even pings you to remind you to contact them. And it doesn't tell you what to say. It lets you type in a message and then it sends that off. It just makes the barriers to influence lower by making it easier for you to contact your reps. So those are things that work on the level of people, but you can also have companies that work on the level of government. So the company called Socrata does services for governments, making data more accessible and making government more transparent. So they did a website for the state of Hawaii showing campaign spending so that you can just look up how much money different candidates got and from what sources. And then there's ways that you can actually run your company, internally, not worrying about external factors. So right here in town, the co-op is a co-op, which means that it is owned in part, or I forget if it's in part or entirely, by the people who are members of the co-op. So if you shop there, you might have your little co-op card. I've got my little co-op card here, which not only gets you a discount for shopping there, but it also means that you can vote for the board of directors. So Professor Cushman-Rosen is one of the people on the board of directors of the co-op because they support that relationship to the community. Okay, excuse me. Okay, then education. Barriers to education here. I don't have any nice fancy graphs or graphics here, but it's basically money, infrastructure, classrooms, books, etc., teachers, gender inequality, and other lack of access. So this is a kind of lack of access, but there's also language or disability. If you're blind, you need special infrastructure and special teachers and stuff like that. And safety as well. If you're living in a country that has a lot of political violence like Congo or Afghanistan, or honestly right in the US, if you live in a poor neighborhood with a lot of violence violence from drugs and gangs and things, it is just as much of a barrier to you getting to school and staying in school. And so solutions to that are making education more affordable, making it more accessible, either by making infrastructure easier to get, or more languages, more disability access, and making things safer, and equity across gender as well. And so some things that people are doing that are good, there's this website donorschoose.org, excuse me, which is sort of like Kickstarter for education, except it's donation-based. And so I, as a teacher, could post a project on there saying, I want to do this cool thing for my students, and here's how much it would cost. And then anyone who visits the website could choose, yeah, I'm going to give $10 to that project, or I'm going to give $5 to that project. There was the One Laptop Per Child project, whose goal was to make high-tech education universally accessible to people in developing countries by making this $100 laptop. And it's interesting, it was actually a spectacular failure in almost all ways. And it was actually a really great example of people not recognizing their privilege, because the guy who started the company, whose idea it was, he just had the assumption that all you need to do is give people a laptop with some, learning software on it, and they will teach themselves. And, they'll all become brilliant programmers. And so he was not recognizing his own privilege growing up, the teachers he had, the other infrastructure that he had, the family support that he had, that made it easy for him to become a computer genius, and not recognizing that those tailwinds would not be present for other people. But great success story, Khan Academy, is a website that has free tutorials on all kinds of subjects, math, physics, engineering, all kinds of stuff. And it has helped easily 10 million people around the world, because it does the accessibility of infrastructure thing. Because as long as you have an internet connection, then you don't need 20 different teachers and 100 textbooks on stuff. You can get a whole lot from one free website. And this is a little hardware company called Little Bits. They make educational toys. And so they're little things where you can learn circuits, and makes it easy to put together electronics and stuff like that, and do some simple coding. And they're explicitly designed to encourage girls in technology fields. And yeah, so there's all kinds of things that you can do. And then finally, meaning. This is what you sort of care about in life. I used to work in the semiconductor industry and made more money than I knew what to do with, but I didn't really care about the job. And so now that I do green design, I care so much about the job that I would do it for free, although don't tell the administration that. It's interesting, actually, economists have quantified how much less you can pay people for work that they really care about. It varies, but an average is around 30% less. Fun fact. And so barriers to meaning are cultural suppression or stigma, telling people that they shouldn't speak their language or eat their food or practice their religion or things like that. And rigid social roles, not seeing people for who they are, but only honoring them as much as they fill a particular role, whether that be in the organization or personally out in the world. We all play social roles of different kinds. And lack of relationship or disconnection of relationship, and then lack of clear purpose in a company as well. And this all gets very subjective and into values. And let's just take a minute to, here are a bunch of things that you might value. And everybody just take a second, either write down or just think in your own head, like what would be like some of the top, let's say top 3 things that you value most here. Okay, and where do you think most companies find their most meaning? Anyone want to throw out an idea? Yeah.
Money.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, in fact, yeah, go ahead.
Power.
Yeah, absolutely. Do those values line up with what your values were? Okay. How could you design your company so that it does line up more with what your values are? If you remember Gene, who came in and pitched one of the projects last Friday, he is incorporated as a B Corp, a public benefit corporation, which means that instead of like a normal company where if you're publicly traded, you have a fiduciary obligation to your shareholders to put money before everything else, is your legal obligation to put money before everything else. But if you're incorporated as a B Corp, you have some mission for the company that, that money cannot take precedence over. And so that's one mechanism that you can use to try to put your values into how the company works. And so some solutions to this are diversity and inclusion, both in hiring practices and how you treat people in meetings and in the lunchroom and stuff like that. And communication training. This goes to the connection and relationship, and then having a clear vision or mission for the company. So some examples, Dartmouth has an Office of Institutional Diversity and Equity. I don't have a ton of experience with them to know what specifically they've done and not done, but just the fact that Dartmouth students all used to be white men 100 years ago and are no longer means that they're doing something, at least. And then having sort of social goals and clear goals, like doing solar installation is a very tangible, concrete thing where you can say, this is a value that I'm providing. Or the company TerraCycle has an explicit mission statement saying that the purpose of the company is to eliminate the concept of waste. And then there are a lot of companies, and I'm not going to endorse any one particular one, but there are a lot of companies that do communication and relationship training. You can take classes on how to communicate well, how to have better relationship skills. It kind of mystifies me that that we just go through life thinking that we'll handle this stuff. You would never try to rederive calculus from first principles to do an engineering problem. And people are way more complex than calculus. So why would you ever expect that you should figure things out with a difficult coworker or boss or, trouble that you're having in a relationship, on your own rather than like learning the skills? Okay, so those were sort of summary of all the different social sustainability aspects. And then how do you measure this stuff? There are a lot of certifications and standards out there. There's SA 8000 by Social Accountability International, SAI. There's Fair Trade, which is a more widely known one, but this one has been around longer. Rainforest Alliance, they have both environmental and social aspects of their certification, as do other things like Cradle to Cradle and FSC certification for wood. And then there are things that are not certifications but just guidelines, like the UN Global Compact and Global Reporting Initiative, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And to look at what some of these things measure, SA8000, they have metrics for child labor, forced labor, health and safety, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is how many companies they've certified around the world. It's about 3,500. And there's even a social life cycle assessment that is still in the nascent stages. And these are some of the things that they measure. But I would actually not really recommend this for making decisions yet, because so far there's only one database and it just goes on the country level. So for child labor statistics, it'll just give you like, our manufacturing is in China, and therefore we have such percentage of child labor as opposed to if we had manufacturing in Vietnam or something. And so I don't think that's a fine enough grained detail to make decisions on, but it's great that people are starting to do the science here to try to quantify this stuff. And so it's an interesting frontier. So, okay, wrapping everything up, if your company could do anything, where would you do the most good? And again, I think that, you know, it's not easy to quantify these, and so I don't have these in a numerical order. It's just kind of a bullet list. But one thing is you can certify your operations according to, you know, SA8000 or fair trade or other standards, and your supply chains as well, because that is often a bigger source of inequality than your own operations. You can have diversity and inclusion programs, build relationships within the company and between your company and local communities. And then drive equity in wealth, influence, education, and your own operations. Okay, any questions on that?